Another key component of osmoregulation is getting rid of nitrogenous waste. These are solutes that are toxic that build up in blood and that your body needs to get rid of. We'll talk about different types of waste and the systems that produce them, including invertebrate nephridial systems, but we'll spend most of our time talking about the nephron, which is the functional unit of the vertebrate kidney. The breakdown of proteins and nucleic acids, DNA, produces toxic amino groups as a waste product. Your body does not want to keep this byproduct inside because it's toxic, so it needs to get rid of it. And it does this in one of three ways, by producing three different chemicals, which vary in their complexity, their chemical complexity, but they also vary in terms of how much water is necessary to get rid of the particular waste type. The different waste types are ammonia, urea, and uric acid, with ammonia being the chemically most simple and uric acid being the most complex. Why would you want a simple versus a complex molecule? It's energy. Simple molecules take less energy to make than complex molecules, but there's a cost to that simplicity. Ammonia, for instance, is extraordinarily toxic and therefore must be diluted with large amounts of water. Uric acid, on the other hand, is very complex and costly to produce, but it can be produced and excreted with almost no water loss. So we have this trade-off between the metabolic cost of production versus water conservation. Animals that are not water challenged simply produce ammonia, whereas desert animals like most desert reptiles and birds produce uric acid. If you've ever seen bird or snake poop, you'll see the brown substance, which is the feces produced by the intestines, and then the white substance, which is the uric acid. That is the nitrogenous waste product that they are getting rid of. Where is all this stuff produced? Regardless of the organisms we're talking about, the nitrogenous waste products are produced in tubes or tubules. And tubes are great because they're very long and they're surrounded by a membrane, so they're permeable. And because they're long, you can have very different concentrations of a substance on one end of the tube than on the other. So they filter fluids very well because they are surrounded by a membrane, and that allows them to reabsorb nutrients and water back into the organism. The first type of tubule we are going to look at are Malpighian tubules. These are things that are found in insects. They are branches of the excretory system, of the digestive system. So here we see part of the intestine with the feces inside of the intestine, and then these Malpighian tubules sticking off into the body cavity of, for instance, a grasshopper. And the nitrogenous waste, water, salts, all sorts of stuff is simply absorbed into these tubules, and then it makes its way into the intestine, where it then moves down towards the rectum. And just like in the vertebrate intestine, the distal portion of the intestine of this insect actually allows for the reabsorption of molecules, salts, waters, things that are useful for the organism. So anything that is absorbed by the Malpighian tubules and brought into the digestive system and the intestines that's useful can be reabsorbed back into the body at the distal portion of the intestine. What about things like flatworms and earthworms? They use tubules as well. If you look at a flatworm, they have these things called flame cells that stick off, and just like the Malpighian tubules in insects, although shorter, they lead to these collecting tubules, and these collecting tubules lead to excretory pores that allow the animals to get rid of waste to the external environment. If you look at an earthworm, each individual segment has something called a nephrostome, which again is a long tube surrounded by a blood vessel here. The blood vessel is bringing the waste products to the nephrostome, and it can be filtered out within this tube, and then the waste products excreted through something called a nephridia pore, which exits to the external environment. And here's a cartoon that shows it in more detail. Obviously, what I showed you is very simple, but what you have is a very long tube in green. The longer the tube, the more filtration can occur, and it's surrounded by a network of capillaries that will allow for the absorption and reabsorption of substances that may be useful to the worm. Finally, in vertebrates, they have a kidney with lots and lots of nephrons. Nephrons are the functional unit, and we'll talk about them in more detail in a minute, but the take-home message is the same. The nephron consists of long tubes that allow for the filtration of nitrogenous waste and the collection of that waste for excretion. Let's talk about the kidney, because that is where pee is produced. The kidneys are fist-sized structures. They are paired. They are served by a very large artery and vein, the renal artery and the renal vein. The artery brings blood to the kidneys. The vein takes blood away from the kidneys. Your body has about 5 liters of blood. That's not a lot. That's between a gallon to a gallon and a half. You might think you have more, but it's flowing through your body very rapidly. And it flows through your kidneys an enormous number of times. Over the course of a day, about 1,500 liters of blood flows through your kidneys and is filtered. At any given time, 25% of the blood in your body is in your kidneys and is being filtered. And your kidneys consist of a renal cortex on the outside. Cortex means bark in Latin. You then have a network of veins and arteries that are critical to servicing the nephrons. And then on the interior portion, you have something called the renal medulla. And all of these lead to a renal pelvis, which leads to the ureter, which moves to the bladder for the collection of urine. 1,500 liters of fluid flows through your kidneys during the day, and that produces about 1.5 liters of urine per day. Let's see how this works. The circulatory system, your blood, meets the excretory system, your kidney, at an organ called the Bowman's capsule within a nephron. Blood flows into the Bowman's capsule via a capillary and branches out into these smaller capillaries that might only be 1 red blood cell thick into the structure called a glomerulus. Now, the blood in the glomerulus is under intense pressure. And so what happens is, because of that intense blood pressure, they're very leaky. So what leaks out? Ions, sugars, amino acids, all sorts of stuff leaks out into the Bowman's capsule from the glomerulus. Once it's leaked out of the glomerulus, it is no longer in the circulatory system. It has entered the excretory system. Any fluid or blood that does not leak out right here simply continues down out of the kidney. Just proximal to the Bowman's capsule and glomerulus right here is something called the proximal tubule. Proximal tubule means the tubule that is closest to the Bowman's capsule. And if you look at the epithelial cells that line that proximal tubule, you'll see that they have a brushy border. That is, they are covered in little microvilli, and you've seen that somewhere before. Where have you seen that? Yeah, if you answered the intestine, you're right. So just like in the intestine, the purpose of those microvilli was to increase the surface area for absorption. And it's the same here, because not everything that leaks out of the glomerulus is something your body wants to get rid of. There are lots of useful things like sugars, ions, amino acids that your body wants to reabsorb, and it can do so right in this proximal tubule with this brushy border that has a high surface area for reabsorption. There are two nephron types. There's something called a juxtamedullary, which goes from the renal cortex all the way down into the renal medulla. And there's one called the cortical nephron, which simply stays within the renal cortex. You don't need to know the difference between the two, just know that they both exist. Here we are with the Bowman's capsule and glomerulus there, and you can see that they are served by a branch of this little artery right here. Right next to the Bowman's capsule is the proximal tubule for both, and then you see that the proximal tubule leads down to this really long U-shaped tube. Here's the U-shaped tube right here. It is called the loop of Henle because it was first described by an anatomist named Henle. There are two parts to the loop of Henle. There is a descending limb. That's the portion that goes down. And there is an ascending limb. That is the portion that goes up. At the end of the ascending limb is a distal tubule. Remember, we had a proximal tubule right here. So over here we have a distal tubule that leads to a collecting duct, and this is where the urine will be collected on its way to the bladder. In reality, this nephron is completely surrounded by a network of arteries, veins, and capillaries because in addition to the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule being a site of excretion and reabsorption, the entire nephron itself is a site of reabsorption. So everywhere along the loop of Henle is a potential site of reabsorption, and so this is critical to the function of the nephron itself. Let's stick with the simplified view for now. The substance that leaks out of the glomerulus and starts moving through the proximal tubule is called filtrate. So that filtrate makes its way down to the descending limb of the loop of Henle. And what happens in that descending limb? Well, in the descending part of the loop of Henle, it is completely filled with a protein called an aquaporin. And an aquaporin does one thing and one thing only. It lets water through. Now, water is something that your body may want to hold on to, and so this is a one-way path for water to leave the filtrate and to be reabsorbed by the capillaries that are surrounding the descending limb right here. So aquaporins line the descending portion of the loop of Henle. They let water through. Nothing else exits the filtrate here. And what this means is that the deeper we go down the descending limb, the saltier the filtrate gets because water is being removed from the filtrate and reabsorbed by the body. So, what's the role of the descending limb of the loop of Henle? It's to recapture water. Now, at the bottom of the loop of Henle, we have this extraordinarily salty filtrate. Let's see what happens as it moves up the ascending limb. As we move up the ascending limb, we are taking those salts and we are pushing them out of the loop of Henle, and into this sort of interstitial space in between the ascending limb of the loop of Henle here and the collecting duct. Initially, these salts simply move by diffusion because there's a very high concentration of salts right here in the loop of Henle, and this area right here doesn't have very much salt. But as we move up, it becomes more difficult to move these salts into this interstitial space. Why? Because again, the concentration of salts is now very high out here, but your body still wants to do it. And so it actively pumps salts across a membrane, but it can't do it using simple diffusion, so it has to use active diffusion, which means it takes a little bit of energy to continue to push those salts across the membrane. But nevertheless, we continue to remove salts from the ascending limb and make this space in between the ascending limb and the collecting duct as salty as possible. And you may be asking why, and I will explain in just 1 second. So, let's quickly review. The role of the nephron is to rid blood waste of things you don't want, but to reabsorb things that you do want. The interface of the excretory system and circulatory system is the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus within. The filtrate that leaves the glomerulus moves through the proximal tubule. Here you can see some of the things that are absorbed. Of course, you don't need to remember that. That just shows you. Here are some of the things that are reabsorbed by your body. Here are some of the things that are absorbed into the proximal tubule. We reach the loop of Henle, and here's the descending limb. The role of the descending limb is to get rid of water. Let your body reabsorb that water. At the bottom here, you have very concentrated filtrate or urea. As we move up the ascending limb, we pump out salts, chloride ions, potassium ions, sodium ions. Once we reach the distal tubule, we continue to get rid of things that we want to reabsorb into the body. And then eventually we have the collecting duct. Now, we haven't talked about ADH yet, so let's talk about it now. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone, and it is a key hormone in regulating water concentration in your body. When you get thirsty, or when your body recognizes that you need water, chemical signals can be sent out that say, hey, go get a drink of water. That's one way that you can go get water. But a second way is that your pituitary gland releases a hormone called anti-diuretic hormone. And this hormone travels to your kidney in your blood until it reaches the nephron. Oops, let's try this again.
Hormones regulate water reabsorption by the nephron tubule in response to body fluid intake and loss. On a hot day, when you're sweaty and thirsty, blood solute concentration rises. In response,
Let's try that one more time. I accidentally hit the button. Okay, here we go.
Hormones regulate water reabsorption by the nephron tubule in response to body fluid intake and loss. On a hot day, when you're sweaty and thirsty, blood solute concentration rises.
That's here.
In response, the brain signals the posterior pituitary to increase its output of the hormone ADH. ADH makes the walls of the collecting duct more permeable to water. Recall that the interstitial fluid surrounding the nephron tubule has a high solute concentration.
Right
ADH
here.
allows more water to leave the filtrate by osmosis and re-enter the blood. The body conserves water and concentrated urine is produced. When you have been drinking more water and not losing much fluid, the blood becomes more dilute. The brain responds by decreasing the secretion of ADH. The collecting duct becomes less permeable and less water is reabsorbed. The body produces dilute urine.
So remember when we were talking about pumping salts out of the ascending limb into the region between the ascending limb of the loop of Henle and the collecting duct. And you might have been asking yourself, why? Well, the reason why is so that when ADH is released, you have an extremely salty area outside of the collecting duct that water wants to flow to. So by making the collecting duct more permeable, water leaves the collecting duct and moves back into your body. And one way you can tell that this is happening is when you've been exercising on a hot, sweaty day and you haven't had a lot of water and you go pee, that pee is dark yellow and it smells because there's not a lot of water in that urine because ADH has told your body to reabsorb as much water as it can. Conversely, when you've had plenty of water and you don't need any more water, and in fact, your body wants to get rid of excess water, it turns down the amount of ADH, which reduces the permeability of the collecting duct. And now, even though water may want to flow into that really salty region, the collecting duct is no longer permeable because there's no ADH, and very dilute urine moves to the bladder. And again, you can test this. Go drink a bunch of water and sit around and then go pee, and the pee is basically watercolored and doesn't smell. Okay, that's it for our treatment of osmoregulation. Until next time.